Yeah, yeah. These are agents of a deep conspiracy that. Why do you think it is that in, what was it, 2010 or something, that my work became even more psychological? It had been before, but it became, because there was so much to explore in the years before. And why it's continued that way, because how can anybody solve anything on this topical level when they've already worked on subterranean levels, right? The damage has been done. The bombs have been planted below the threshold. So moving the fucking furniture on the fucking Titanic isn't going to change shit. And we are headlong, somebody grab the wheel like a Donald Trump. Yeah, maybe it'll help. Fuck it. Even if we're off 1 degree, maybe we'll miss that iceberg. I'm with them. Yeah, let's give it a go, mate. But without that, and even despite that, we are plunging over the abyss. So we cannot be politically fucking correct, right? If we want to fight these Googles and these tyrants, and also the mugs in between who keep, they're like the packing, the useful idiots. They're the packing. So you can't even get to the enemy because you got all these losers in the way. Trying to, and then you just need to look at them and say, Friedrich Engels, how did you get to be Friedrich Engels? Wasn't it through a family? Or did you just wash up on the beach one day? And your forefathers and your forefathers and forefathers, right? How did they get to be who they were so that you could be who you were? I mean, it's, right? The goo is so, like I said at the very beginning of this program, it's not that difficult to undermine and contradict these people, but you have first to withdrawal symptoms from their incredible propaganda that pours through the media and through the colleges and schools. So there's phases of deconditioning, deprogramming yourself. But after you do it, and then you start, like we do, hey, watch The Prisoner, watch, the Greek critiques, get symbolically literate again. I'm talking about seismically, down deep inside. Some of the intellectual stuff is real good to know, and I'm glad to see some people have that nailed. But what about some other more fortifying aspects, like the symbolic literacy, like the divination aspect, and in the psychological empowerment in general? All my work is dedicated to that. That's why I think it's second to none, but you better believe it that they're working deeply on the psyche. Can we go to the first slide? We can actually look at something interesting here. Pertinent. Yeah, there's their existential trinity, talking about the deeper layers of how this works. You are Eigenwelt. Welt is world, right? Welt in Dutch, German, Weld. Eigen is the inner world. Umwelt is the world around, and mit is with. So the with world is with other people. So each human being that's listening to this is a trinity, an existential trinity. But all of these are affected by parenting. Eigenwelt, especially. Right? Parenting ain't going to do much for the umwelt, but it does. How you see nature is obviously going to be like, I keep hearing you say that you take your kids to nature. You know how fucking good that is? Because if the parent doesn't introduce the child to animals, to a garden, and to the wider nature, this component of the umwelt is real in the shit, right? Or if they don't watch nature programs, the whole thing. Because that body, universe, on a philosophical level, is just the extended body that you have. Your physical body is made from the same mud, the same components, the same roots and soil, as the earth is. We'll have a whole conversation about that, right? But then the Mitwelt is all the rest of the culture that is your culture, not those guys down on the equator or east of fucking Prague, right? If you're a white Caucasian, you have a culture, and that is not a multiculture. It is a culture. And then they have theirs, and there's beautiful parts of all of these things. That's why we are not in any way, racist. We might be segregationists, but that's a whole other conversation. That's because we want to preserve a culture, which is a bubble that only the thinking and the traditions that go into that are absolutely sacrosanct. Of course, we know that's under attack as well from these postmoderns, right? So the parent, though, coming back to the story, is the parent affects each and every one of these parts of the existential trinity, but particularly the Eigenwelt. The influence them all, right? In other words, that parental influence, whether it's a single parent or double, whatever, good or bad, the parent is influencing the child. And the story of Dragon Mother both the program and the book, in this case, there's a similar thread, similar themes, what I'm going to say now, is that the parent's influence becomes embodied, right? Interjected. I kind of like the word embodied because it involves that this is also happening on a somatic level, okay? But we won't split hairs over that right now. We'll just say that the voice of the parent and the parent's influence is embodied, and that is known in psychological parlance as the superego, something that superveils, or even surrounds, or at least guides and monitors the ego, something that the ego is listening to first. The id, which is the unconscious, and then a thing called the conscience, which is a deeper seat of morality. Those are a little bit back there, right? Because the superego has inserted a surveillance system, a tremendous audio system. So, it makes you jump. That's your moral center, the superego. And another part of that, there's another structure there called the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is actually so important. It can be for the negative as well, by the way, but it's actually one of the big solutions. So I don't know if we'll get time to do it here, but if we ever did get the solutions about this problem, it would be the ego ideal at this point then that would become a factor. But we'll leave that separately for now. The superego, then, that structure which surrounds and guides the ego is really to be considered, the way I do it in the program, is that it is the counterpart. It's opposed by the conscience, right? So there's two parts of us working, and therefore, because they're not in sync, there's anxiety. So some people's depression, some people's anxiety is based on just the fact that you are a dyad. The parents set up a dyad. Society sets up a dyad. So one person is not themselves complete. They're two people, and that's already conflictual. It's already a contrarium within. Now in the book, not in the book, but in the program, I examine an interesting theory, because Freud is the guy who came up with the idea that we're talking about, with the superego. Later on, people that we now know to identify forensically as these fucking postmodernists, these cultural Marxists and critical scientists, critical theorists, one of the high priests of them wrote a book. His name is Elie Sagan, and he wrote a book on Freud that I critique in the program. That's what it's all about. And what am I critiquing about him? Is his re-scripting of the story of the development of the superego. And that, as I said, comes about as the result of what's known as the Oedipus stages. That's what they're for. The Oedipus stages lead to a developed superego, say around the age of 6 and 7 when it's all over. People say it's all over before that, but now it's really over. Because it is by way of the superego, let's think of it as a filter by which you view reality. So the surgery of how that's going to be comported, it's like a crystal, what distance away it is, what level of magnitude it is, the light. The parents are busy, screwing that into your head. The conscience, when you look through conscience, you see the world completely differently. Hence the education, the Krishnamurtis trying to get you to reorient, and Ayn Rand. There's so many great teachers we deal with, right, who are trying to forget that. Let's look at the world through conscience, which is empathy and so many other wonderful things. As I said, the ego ideal has a huge role in that. But we're mostly looking through the superego, which isn't all bad. I mean, it's not all bad. It is a moral center after all. But its morality is much more shaky. In philosophical terms, it is not as rooted in the organic soil of reality. It's rooted in the reality as presented by the parents. And that can be real fucking bad, actually, when in the more severe cases, right? But anyway,
or society as well, right? Like society as well would be another thing exactly.
Yeah. That's why we had to show this trinity, because it's not just you going into it, it's how it affects you. So the Hegels and the great experts who talked about this, if you want to understand a Hegel, you have to understand he was having this existential trinity in his mind very deeply, as most of the great thinkers did. They all have a comment. So he was talking about that overlap, the Eigenwelt, right? The Mitwelt is moving in on you as well. These are influencing you, right? So look at the gray areas in between, right? You see, each one of these influences the other. So Eigenwelt, that's you, the individual, is certainly going to have an impact in your culture, in either a malignant or non-malignant way. Social justice warriors having an influence, but the regular scientist, progressive, and rational type, he's having an influence too. But it works vice versa. The Mitwelt can have an influence on you, and that can be also malignant, or it can be positive, you see, and so on. This is a beautiful scheme to keep in mind, right? But I go after this Elie Sagan, who's rescripting Freud's understanding of the superego and talking about a different theory of it, of based in this idea that it's needs to be replaced with conscience. So on paper, it's a beautiful book. It looks great. Here's this thesis. Oh my God, what, yeah, heavy hitter, top brow. And this is a manual. Then this becomes a manifesto for all the other people that he would educate. You see, and all these other psychologists. He's actually a psychologist. You see. But basically, what he's saying is that he's picking up on some quasi-Freudian facts, which is that the superego structure, a la the Victorian age, comes about or arises from the father's influence primarily. Right? So he's sort of holding to that theory, and he's trying to then tell you this, and this is where things get very deceptive. By bringing out this quasi-Freudian part, he now can say the theme of his book can become that the conscience is under the jurisdiction, and arises within you. This deeper, more holistic sense of morality is the product of the mother. So again, all sounds good on paper, right? Until you realize what a fucking utter deception it is. So in the Dragon Mother program and book, I try to deconstruct this model, right? And show, I investigate the claim, which is extraordinary thesis comes out of that then, because it is a deceptive thesis that they're putting forth. If it gets put forth, or it has been put forth, in other words, all the brains, like the George Soroses and your Etzionis, and all these people are building the communitarian model, they're basing it on Eli Sagan's model. So whether the street level, like running amok with their pink hats, gets what we're talking about or not, they're being steered by this anyway, because the bigger brows up in the United Nations and these different orgs, they completely have bitten down on this, right? So I investigate this claim. With the idea, like we've already said, that if you have a physical handicap, say a child suddenly gets an autoimmune disease and is confined to a wheelchair, or somebody else, eats something that proves, infectious and basically debilitates them, we understand that that's one thing. We can isolate it, we can see it, we can even treat it. But our society is so psychologically immature still that if you get a psychological disease, or if the emotions of a person are handicapped, we are hampered and entrapped, in our movements to diagnose it. So we've got to understand the first step then to wise up is to understand that some parents are not satisfied with parenthood